making the time to join us on a Monday evening. So here we are with our very first Win the Era community event of the year. And believe it or not, we're at the end of May because yes, 2021 is almost halfway through. I hope that you've all had an opportunity over the last few months to rest and recover and catch your breaths a little bit from the political season. But the honest truth is the work really never ends. And few people know that better than the folks that we're going to be in conversation with this evening. And I think it's really fitting that we're getting together in our first event to discuss the most important and timely of topics, democracy reform. We're joined this evening by leaders from three really important groups that are on the front lines of the work on democracy reform: Democracy Docket, Fair Fight Action, and Demand Justice. This is an issue that has always been one of the most motivating for our community. We spoke quite a bit about it over the campaign cycle. And actually, as Win the Era was coming together, a number of you told us that this was the top issue that you cared about and wanted to become more informed on and learn how you could make a difference. So that's what this evening is all about. We know that you're eager and looking for ways to stay involved and to channel your activism and enthusiasm to make a difference. So we're hopeful that our conversation this evening will give you ideas on what you can do over the short, medium, and long term to reinvigorate and save our democracy. And to shepherd our understanding, we're joined by Marc Elias, who many of you know as the founder of Democracy Docket, an organization that is doing such important work around the country to shore up our rights to vote and on election litigation across the country. Many of you, like me, probably look to Marc's Twitter account to offer some solace and comfort and assurance last year, especially in the fall. We're also joined by what will be a familiar face to many of you, José Morales, who was part of the campaign community on Pete's campaign and is currently part of the team at Fair Fight Action. He's the Deputy Director of Voter Protection there. He's a New York native and currently helping Fair Fight Action on their voter protection efforts. And he works on their national strategy to pass federal voting protections for all people to have equal access to the ballot. So José's here to speak to us about some of the work that he's currently engaged in and his organization. And we're also lucky to learn this evening from Tamara Brummer, who is the Senior Advisor for Engagement and Outreach at Demand Justice, an organization that some of you might have heard of that's doing really important work to broaden outreach and deepen relationships across organizations and movements supporting court reform, which is a really important tenet of the overall democracy reform effort. And Tamara's got a really rich and long history working in labor movement building and growing power and membership for working people across the country. She comes to this work having spent a fair bit of time working at places like AFL-CIO and SEIU as well. So eager to have you hear from all three of these amazing folks on their work and the issues at hand. And a reminder that, as always, our events are for your edification. So we encourage you to ask questions. You can do that by using the Q&A feature or writing questions into the chat box, and Maxwell and I will help shepherd those to our speakers. So without further ado, if we can hand off, Marc, the stage is yours to share a little bit more about your work at Democracy Docket.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you so much. When I was building Democracy Docket, one of the first, if not the first, organization that offered public support. I think probably you all got an email from them telling them about Democracy Docket, was Win the Era. And so when I had the opportunity to speak to you all, I wanted to do so because of all the incredibly important work that this organization does. And the topic is timely because our democracy right now is under attack. Never in recent history have we had one political party that has as its sole plank the undermining of voting rights. Right now, you can be a pro-business Republican or an anti-business Republican. You can support free trade, you can oppose free trade. You can be in favor of the minimum wage increase or against a minimum wage increase. The only thing you can't be in today's Republican Party is in favor of voting rights. Think about that. The only thing that will lead to your exclusion from the Republican Party is to say that Donald Trump didn't win the election, that the big lie is a lie, and that voter suppression is wrong. In fact, even Lynn Cheney, who was kicked out of the leadership of the Republican Party for the first part of that, she voted against the For the People Act and will be a no vote for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because there is no place in the Republican Party for that. So where that leaves us for organizations like Win the Era, like Fair Fight, is to be out there every day fighting for voting rights. So I do that by bringing litigation, and through Democracy Docket by amplifying the important work of others. Demand Justice, an organization I love and wholeheartedly endorse. I think I'm on your board of something or others. Is out there telling the truth about the courts, which is that Donald Trump and the Federalist Society have stacked this judiciary from top to bottom, and that progressives need to be in the fight. Just today, 2 wonderful appointments in New York on the Second Circuit and the New York Federal District Court in the Southern District. But I know we're going to have a lively discussion, but the fight for voting rights and the fight for democracy is the fight of our time. And whether it is doing the work that I do in the courts, or whether it's in bringing litigation, or the work that José does with Fair Fight, or the work that Tamara does, it's really important. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to participating tonight.
Thank you, Marc. José?
Hi, everyone. I wish I could see everyone's face again like it was 2019. And a lot has happened since we were probably in the same room and where we are.
Does that mean that, by the way, back then you were able to control the Zoom so you could see everyone's face?
I'm not as good at it anymore. I'm telling you that they won't let me behind the scenes anymore. It is really good to be having this conversation right now. I know this weekend was full of news. There's also a very hot summer coming up. If you don't know about Fair Fight Action, along with Democracy Docket and Demand Justice, we are fighting day in and day out, not just in Georgia, where it was founded after Stacey Abrams's 2018 gubernatorial run, but we do a lot of work in supporting our partners on the ground in states where Republicans are pushing anti-voter bills. So I know the federal bills are something that Win the Era and also a lot of the folks who work in this space have been talking about. I'm also looking forward to talking about some of the victories we've notched on the state level as well, because as this community knows, so many of the people in the progressive movement who rise to prominence get their start on the local level. The same can unfortunately be said for those who oppose voting rights and oppose democracy reform. So I am very, very much looking forward to how we talk about the nexus between what's going on in your community and what goes on in the halls of Congress, outside and between. And I'm just really excited also to hear from Tamara and Marc. I get to be on all of their newsletters. I get to follow them as y'all do on every form of social media. But this really is going to take community and grassroots power in a way that I think a lot of folks where you got your vaccine, so you're ready to go outside and be at the beach and not see the 4 walls of your room anymore. But there's a renewed commitment that needs to be made tonight and going through the next few months for what needs to be done for the folks who can't be on calls like this, who can't spend a Monday night turning these questions over. So excited to be talking. Thanks, Lucky.
Wonderful. Tamara?
Good evening, everyone. First off, shout out to all the folks from Indiana in the chat. Indianapolis, born and raised, what? But yeah, it's so great to be with you all today. I'm with an organization by the name of Demand Justice. And at our very core, we are a single issue organization. We care about structural court reform. And we were founded about 3 years ago in 2018 by 2 former high-level staffers within the government who had been a part of the judicial nomination process and had seen the machine that the Republicans had created to stack the courts from not just the Supreme Court, but all the way down to the lowest courts in our federal judiciary. And what our theory of change is that progressives need to pay just as much attention to the court as we pay attention to all the other dynamic issues that we're talking about today. Yet I feel like the house that I get to live in, like the lane that I get to be in, is I have the pleasure of connecting the dots for us as activists and as community about why our federal courts are just as important as our House and our Senate and our White House. The reason we're in the predicament that we are now is not a coincidence. It wasn't that just one day they decided to strip and dismantle the Voting Rights Act, but it was an act of the Supreme Court. And that we are still paying for that to this day. And we are going to continue to pay for it until we decide as a movement, as a community, which I know you all are. I know you already believe in it. I'm talking to the choir here. So this is for you to be pumped up to talk to your people back home, is that we have to do the kinds of things and take the kind of bold changes that make our Supreme Court and our lower federal courts more reflective of the American people and more reflective of the values that we hold as the American people and as a democracy. And I'm really excited to talk to you all tonight about some of the things that we propose. And I think that many of the partners who are on the call also believe in how we really create a more robust democracy by ensuring that our federal judiciary is one that is upheld and viewed by the people in a way that we can still trust and hold dear.
Thank you all for those really impactful and tight overviews. If we can just get into some of the questions that folks were curious to learn about, I think one really easy place to start is we're hearing a lot about acronyms like HR1 and S1. What are they? How important are they in the overall democracy reform effort? And what's the path to passing them? What can the folks on this call do to help there?
Who do you want to answer?
Whoever's most inclined. Is that you volunteering, Mark?
Mark volunteers.
I'll do the first part. So let me define what the different pieces are and then pass it maybe to Jose to deal with how we get it passed. There are two bills that are most often discussed. HR1, which is the same as S1. Okay, so S1 is just the same bill as HR1, but the House called it HR1. So of course the Senate wanted to also call it their own thing, so they called it S1. So HR1 S1 is otherwise known as the For the People Act. And what it does is, in the voting arena, is it sets minimum thresholds that all states need to follow. So states can do more than that, but states can't do less. So states have to provide a certain number of days of early voting. They have to allow certain rights to vote by mail. They have to make certain changes or allow certain types of voter registration. Now, states can do more than that, right? States can provide more opportunities of voting, but it sets a minimum floor for voting rights. The bill also has other provisions that, for example, would do away with partisan gerrymandering. It makes changes to campaign finance laws, the government ethics rules. But on the voting front, the way to think about it is it sets a floor for the right to vote. The other bill that you'll hear sometimes referred to is HR4, or the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. HR4 is the bill number that it had last Congress. It actually doesn't have a bill number this Congress yet. But what that does is restores a provision that the Supreme Court struck down in Shelby County versus Holder to the Voting Rights Act, which essentially required states with histories of discrimination to make sure that any changes they make to their voting laws do not make it harder or more difficult for minority voters to vote by having those provisions pre-cleared, in other words, reviewed in advance by the Department of Justice or by a DC court. So if a state or a county that has a history of voting discrimination wants to change the law in a way that might impact minority voters, that provision has to be reviewed by the Department of Justice or a DC federal court to make sure that it doesn't retrogress, which is the legal term that you'll hear kicked around. In other words, make voting harder, more difficult for those minority voters. Now, why do you need both HR1 and HR4? Because HR1 sets a floor and says no state can be worse than this. HR4, or the John Lewis Act, says having provided certain rights to vote for minority voters, any change to that has to be reviewed to make sure that you're not making things worse. So that's what the two provisions are. They're both important. And Fair Fight, I know, has been working very hard on the passage issues. So I'll hand it off to Jose.
Thanks. So everything Marc said is correct. And right now, everything you know about the bills, you now know more than the average American. The fact of the matter is so many communities right now are actually still just coming out of the pandemic, still putting their life back together if they can. That is the very reality we live in. And for folks who are very plugged into the acronyms, the For the People Act, the John Lewis Act, retrogression, pre-clearance, it can feel like, okay, I get it now, so why doesn't everybody else get it? And what I'm really excited about for the next couple of weeks, and something that we're going to be announcing very soon on Fair Fight's side, is a way to bring the message to more people. More people need to know about these acts. More people need to ask their senators why they don't support it yet, what they're doing to support it, and also to thank them for standing up about it. And there is an environment right now where we may feel like this is the time to pull back and reassess, and absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. We are very clear that history is on our side when it comes to the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act. We're not sure about the present, but we have to make the future. So what's going to be happening over the next few weeks is saying, everyone you know who has a landline, a cell phone, a mailbox, a pen, has to contact their senator every day. Because something that also happens that folks who are interested in the palace intrigue of Congress may find exciting is that senators also talk to each other about what they're doing. I think you saw today, senators within the Democratic caucus were like, what are we doing next? What's going on here? It is extremely important right now to let folks who are on the side of the voters know we've got your back. Because right now what they've heard is a lot of disinformation, right-wing media spin that gives cover to anti-voter action that governors like Brian Kemp and Doug Ducey can do and give Greg Abbott carte blanche to do this in the middle of the night. Don't give them that cover. There needs to be a renewed commitment right now for the Senate to say there cannot be any obstacles left to passing voting rights. It is protective and indicative of all other rights. The same as this is true for the For the People Act. And once we get the language for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that's going to be just as important. And one of the things you're going to see around the John Lewis Act that you've already seen around the For the People Act is what's called building the congressional record. Basically, Congress saying, we did this because, and then they roll out a scroll that goes miles and miles and miles. This is why organizations like Demand Justice are also important, because when judges look at these laws, they're looking at these records, and we need a diverse American bench to be looking at that record. And part of this record can also be the people who are on this call, calling every day and saying, yeah, hey, it's me again. You might become friends with the staffer at that point, and saying, this matters to me so much that I have to call every day. And one thing on the Peak campaign I thought we did incredibly well was relational organizing. This idea that you can talk to somebody else in your community who doesn't yet know about the bill or thinks both bills are the same thing and say, we have more resources now. And if you go to stopjimcrow2.com, we have all of these resources for you. And tomorrow we'll be making an announcement about how you can get further involved in what's next for the federal fight. So I'm gonna stop there, kick it over to Tamara to build or edit anything I just said.
Well, you all took all my talking points. I guess I'm done here. No, but I think that when I think about these two pieces of legislation, which I know there's a lot of good conversation in the chat about, well, what if we can't break the filibuster? What happens then? I believe we'll break the filibuster. My concern is that they will contest that in the federal courts for the rest of our existence. They interpret our laws. They interpret the laws. What the Republicans have done really smartly, they've rigged the game. They figured it out. You take the least democratic branch of our federal government and you stack it to be able to uphold your unpopular views and beliefs and policies. So we, the people, have said that we actually want to have more robust access to voting. We saw last year how people came out in the midst of a pandemic, right, through racial uprisings to say, I need to cast my vote, I need to cast it now. And this current Supreme Court, with RBG, rest in peace, had said, well, actually, during a pandemic, you actually do need a voting person, right? Like, this is not about restoring our democracy and our federal judiciary. Our federal judiciary is not composed in the current way that really upholds what we're looking for and what we're doing. So I think all the amazing phone calls that everyone's going to drive into Congress for the People Act, for the John Lewis Act, for adding 4 seats to the Supreme Court, if we don't change the way our Supreme Court and our federal judiciary functions and lives and breathes, we are going to be doing this constantly for generations and generations to come. I tell people this all the time. Before I joined Demand Justice, I was like many of you, very passionate about things. I cared about everything. I had a soapbox for every issue, and I was ready to do the work for those things. But what I wasn't thinking about was the federal courts. And as an organizer, it did not connect to me how hard it was to talk to working people on a job site, how hard it was to talk to undocumented workers in this country, because the Supreme Court had interpreted the law in the way that disenfranchises us across the board. We need a federal judiciary that's not about just the wealthy elite and the corporate elite. We need a federal judiciary that's representative of us. It is the whitest, it is the oldest branch within our government, and it's the one that lacks the most robust ethics, as well as other things that make it more robust and sound for us, that it really works within our framework as a country. So what I tell folks is, like, we talk a lot about like the 3 branches of government, but I always feel like the judiciary, we're like, oh yeah, that's a thing that happens. So we don't think about the judiciary unless there's a vacancy or a lower court judge says that an AR-15 is the same as a Swiss Army knife, right? We didn't get here overnight. And what we really need to think about is, like, what's our future look like as we build the pathway to a more robust democracy, while we untangle the mess that the Supreme Court made with dismantling the Civil Rights Act and Shelby versus Holder in 2013. And now we're trying to be something more robust, right? Through the 2 legislations that Jose and Marc brought up. If we go through this federal judiciary the way it's set up, with over 200 Trump and McConnell lifetime appointees to the federal bench, do you trust our democracy in those hands?
Yep. Great. The questions are just flooding in. So if it's okay, I just want to start working through them. Marc, to switch gears a little bit and talk about redistricting, another component that's also important alongside voting rights. Could you give a quick update on the latest with what's going on with redistricting and why the court cases that the team at Democracy Docket is engaged in are really important, not just for, the upcoming 2022 political cycle, but really the next decade?
Yeah, so great question. So to me, redistricting is just a form of voting rights. There are different ways that Republicans can go about denying people a meaningful opportunity to participate in the process. One is by making it harder to vote. Another is by making the district you vote in unresponsive to the will of the people. And so, I work very closely with the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which is chaired by Eric Holder. We have already brought litigation in 3 states around the latest round of redistricting that we're just beginning. And the way to think about it is that there are 2 stages to the census data release. The first, which happened already, is that every state is told how many districts it will have and what the idealized size of that district is if it's equal population. The next data release will come in August or September, and that will be the actual census data that tells you where within the states people live. And that will allow the drawing of congressional districts, and in most states, state legislative districts, based on that data. We filed lawsuits the day that the apportionment data was released in Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana, because those are states that are going to likely impasse. In other words, because of split governmental control, they won't draw a map, and a map will be drawn by court. And because the data is so delayed this time, due to the Trump administration's politicization of the census and their effort to systematically undercount communities of color, that is what has delayed the release of the census block data. We felt it was important to get lawsuits in place so the courts are up and running and ready to draw lines in those states where we think the courts will have to draw the lines. So that's what's going on. We, like I said, have filed those lawsuits. We are now preparing for the census data release itself and fighting against Republican gerrymandering every place it can. And, this is a place where, not to steal demand justice is thunder, but this is a place where the courts really matter. I mean, the fact is, the Supreme Court found that there was no right to live in a nonpartisan gerrymandered district. And that was a decision of the Supreme Court that will make a profound difference in people's lives. You know, it'll be the difference between living in a district where you can elect your candidate of choice and not. It'll be the difference between having a more responsive Congress and not. It'll be in the difference between having an anti-majoritarian rule in a state and not. So, you know, we fight with the tools that we have available to us. We won 4 cases. I won 4 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court last go around, striking down Republican racial gerrymanders. But the courts matter, and the hard work that's done on the ground matters.
It's actually a really great segue, because my next question is for Tamara. In the last election cycle, a number of candidates, including for this community, Pete, when he was running for president in 2019, 2020, really supported wide, far-reaching court reform and helped bring it into the national dialogue for the first time, highlighting a lot of what you spoke to, why the composition of the courts and the well-functioning of them mattered for folks. What are some of the biggest structural changes that we need to make when it comes to the Supreme Court and really the entire federal bench?
That's a really good question. I think it's a question that most people ask, right? Because to this point of like, what do we do with this entity where we don't feel like we vote for the people who get appointed to the Supreme Court or to the courts? It feels like it's far removed. But I think Marc just laid out eloquently how the decisions in those courts impact our everyday lives. And so for us, we think there's a few key structural court reform pieces that will help to increase our diversity in our bench as well as our democracy. So one of the first things that we think is the most pressing is adding 4 seats to the Supreme Court. And actually there's legislation that was dropped in April of this year called the Judiciary Act of 2021, which is introduced by Congresspersons Nadler, Hank Johnson, and Mondaire Jones, and on the Senate side, Senator Markey, which is a simple policy, a bill that says we need to have 4 seats. And so you ask Tamara, why 4 seats? It's not because 4 is our favorite number, it's a good number, but because we need to bring back balance to the court. Donald Trump stole 2 seats from the American people. One, when Obama, well, this is Mitch McConnell, when Scalia passed away, they waited 16 months. So that actually changed the composition of the Supreme Court. You had then this last year, while in the midst of all of us voting, many of us already starting to vote, votes have already been casted. The Republicans pushed through Amy Coney Barrett in less than 40 days. That's the quickest she got confirmed for a lifetime position quicker than most of us would get approved for a mortgage or an apartment. You see what I'm saying? Like the sense of urgency that they had in that moment it wasn't about being popular. It wasn't about what was right. It wasn't about what was precedent. It was about power and control. So for us, we need to add 4 seats. We also need to do term limits for Supreme Court justices. I don't know everyone knows this, but it's a lifetime position. So what happens is a very political entity already, but once a person gets appointed, then there's nothing else that tethers them to the people or even to the people who appointed them. But we do know that they're tethered to who appoints them. And in this case, it's been overwhelmingly Republicans. And what we think is that we need to add term limits that allow for a transfer of like justices onto the bench representing the party that's in power. The other thing we want to do is we want to set a binding code of ethics. I don't know about this, but I'm still curious about who paid off Brett Kavanaugh's debts when he was confirmed to the Supreme Court. And there's no mechanism right now to really hold him accountable to that. We could try to impeach him, but that feels very far off. But if we think about what do we do to ensure that our justices that are put into positions by our elected officials are following the rule of law and are not using this as a tool for the wealthy elite and the corporate wealthy. I think the other thing that we really want to think about when we're talking about structural court reform is that we need to have a more diverse judiciary, right? And not just at the Supreme Court. We have the potential to have the first Black woman appointed to the Supreme Court if a friend of ours on the bench by the last name of Breyer decides to retire. That gives us a real opportunity to have the first time in the 130 odd years, right, of the Supreme Court and 113 people who have been nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Court, there has never been a Black woman. This is a moment when we think about what's happened in this country in 2020. How did Black women show up for this nation and show up for our democracy, but they don't have a seat at the most powerful court? The same thing is true at our lower courts as well, in the district courts and the circuit courts. And what we propose is that we need to add seats to those courts as well. That has not been the expansion that we've needed. So that means that American people, everyday people, are having a backlog and having their day in court. And that is not a coincidence, it's by design. And what's really powerful about even adding seats to the lower court, it allows us to have a more diverse judiciary, and not just diverse racially, which is important, or gender or other things, but also professionally. We need more judges who have represented people like you and me. We need more judges who have represented workers, who have represented like criminal justice organizations and institutions, who've done voting rights work. We don't need more corporate attorneys whose main clients have been like the corporate elite and the wealthy. So for us, adding to make the judiciary more robust, we have a 4-pillar pieces of like court reform, which we're, once again, adding 4 seats, a code of ethics for the Supreme Court justices, term limits for Supreme Court justices, and also lower court expansion. And the exciting thing too about lower court expansion is that the DNC last year made that a pillar of their platform. So it's something that we know there's political will for it. And I think the same thing for adding seats to the Supreme Court. 3 years ago when demand justice started, when we were like, we need to add seats, people were probably like, y'all are crazy. What are you talking about? You can't do that. But here's the deal. We've changed the configuration of our Supreme Court 7 times. And really the last official time we did it was during the Civil War. Why? Because we wanted to prevent white supremacists from trying to take over our nation and our democracy. We're at the same moment now. We are at a place where our elected officials were held hostage on January the 6th, but they will not call a commission. And if they were to call the commission, do you respect the Supreme Court that we have now, these federal judges that we have now, to uphold any conclusions, any kind of findings? So we think that we need real robust structural court reform, and that the Republicans are very clear and they know how the courts work. And that's why they are able to gerrymander, rig the election so they can put their people on the bench that will outlive all of them. Mitch McConnell, bless his heart, he can leave us today, but he will have over 200 McConnellites who were 28 and 30 years old to lifetime positions I have more experience than you do too, because you probably watch more Law and Order than they have, but they will decide the future of our country if we do not do this type of robust structural reform.
So important. Jose, if you'll entertain a question from a member of our community, from Jeffrey. And I'm posing this question to you because in many ways, Fair Fight was sort of born from the experience in Georgia. We have all seen what has played out in Georgia, even very, very recently with regard to voting access and voting rights. But the question that Jeffrey asks is, how can members of Win the Era's community identify and contact and engage with center-right folks who are natural allies for preventing some of the more extreme GOP positions from taking over? And would work like this or an approach like this be impactful?
I think the answer is something that came up earlier with relational organizing, but also we've at Fair Fight Action put this very intentionally on stopjimcrow2.com, where we're saying business has a role to play here. The affirmation of our lowercase d democratic principles, voting rights, our freedom to vote is not up for debate. And we need businesses to affirm that. And I think you saw a lot of folks try to thread the needle after the attack on the Capitol, where they tried to kill the vice president and some members of Congress. So what we have to remind folks, whether they're a mom and pop shop or it's a retailer that's big and bad that you still use, is saying, where do you stand? We know businesses can do this because they were chomping at the bit in the year 2020 after the murder of George Floyd to affirm and commit to the movement for Black lives. So we know that these folks read the news and they listen to you. So in the ways that you have continued to engage your families, your churches, or your other house of worship, your alumni communities, this has to be something that is proactively brought up. This is as important as when we chose the next president. if not more, because this isn't about one president. It's about whether we get to vote for presidents. This isn't about one senator. It's about whether we get to elect senators. So when we talk about folks who may be center right, center left, apolitical even, folks who don't know what anything we've said, how that ties to them, there should be a conversation. The way that you identified as part of maybe your commitment, whether you supported Peter, you came to win the era after this venture was launched, you have to remember why you support these things. Because if we keep reacting to the news cycle, to the latest gut punch, to the latest poison pill, we forget that we are in the driver's seat. And it's very tempting because for the past 4 years, government happened to us. It kept happening on top of us in a way that felt truly oppressive, not just because it felt that way, literally was that way. So as you're thinking about the ways in which you make the water warm for anything, anyone, you have to remind folks that you're not here because you're a partisan, because you're political. You're here because as somebody who lives in the United States, what it means to live here is to respect our institutions, our Constitution, our freedom to vote, and everything that that affords us, which is to say, I am here, I have made my voice heard, and it's time for my representatives to actually represent me. So if you go to stopjimcrow2.com, you'll see the way in which we ask people who own a business or work with someone in the business community to affirm their commitment to S1, HR1, and HR4. And we need y'all to talk about this with the unexpected fervor of a presidential election.
That message of agency is so important, and I think absolutely the right note to hit when we think about just the overwhelming scale of this challenge and some of the deeply entrenched obstacles that we're tasked with taking on. It's echoed actually by a question that was asked from a number of different folks in our audience this evening. And if I could just paraphrase, I think Jacob did a good job here. You know, there's this sense that we know, for example, with HR1 and S1 and HR4, we're up against the challenges of the filibuster and the challenges that we have in just pulling together the votes to move these things forward. There's a sense that we have perhaps a legislature in place that's not able to move as quickly or as nimbly to reflect the will of the people. And so even if we are making phone calls or working on organizing, it's hard to know what impact they could have. I'd love to hear from each of you sort of where you find your motivation and inspiration from, and what you'd share with the folks on the call this evening on where to tap in and how to reach deep when it can feel overwhelming or daunting or maybe even a little bit fruitless at times, but still so important to be in this really important work.
I can go.
Question for the panel, and feel free to, exactly, great, go for it, Tamara.
What keeps me motivated is that the forefathers of this country absolutely did not think that someone who looked like me, who moved like me, would have any kind of say in what our democracy looks like. I am my ancestors' wildest dreams. They like forged me through their hopes and their dreams and their wishes. And like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are not going to stop our greatness. That's what I really fundamentally believe, that we have fought too hard as a country, as a community, and as people who understand that the act of our democracy is a process, is a constant thing, and we are constantly shaping it. I don't believe that the Constitution is done and we never have to look at it again. We know that's not true. It is our jobs as activists, as believers in the humanity and the democracy of this country and the greatness of our country, to make this the country that our forefathers didn't have the vision to see, but that we do. There was an asterisk in the Constitution, right? Like that didn't apply to me. I'm not who they were thinking about, but it's my responsibility to make sure that the next generation of little Black girls who look like me are one step closer to a more fuller and more robust democracy. We didn't get here overnight, and we won't get there tomorrow, or we won't get there overnight either, but this is a long march to victory and to progress. And I'm thankful to be on the march. I'm thankful to know more. I'm thankful to be able to say, I understand what's going on here, and I know I have a voice and I have power, and that I can build community with others who have that same shared vision for our country.
So when we are winning, of course, it's easy. When we are fighting, it is hard. And I take inspiration from two extraordinary women who I've had the privilege of working for. The first was Hillary Clinton, who, after losing a heartbreaking election in 2016, told all of us who were on her campaign to not leave the fight, that we needed to fight harder. And in her words of both graciousness and affirming democracy, but also telling us to keep on the fight, I redoubled my efforts around voting rights and voting rights litigation. The second is the words, and I would recommend everyone to go back and watch it and go back and read it. The closing words of Kamala Harris at the Democratic National Convention when she accepted the vice presidential nomination. She said that years from now, our children and our grandchildren will ask us about this time, and they will ask us how we felt. And we will tell them not just how we felt, but what we did. And to me, that's really important. It's not enough that years from now, when history is written about this era, that we are able to say, well, we felt that it was wrong. We felt the courts were not fair. We felt that the voting rights were not equal for everyone. But that we'll be able to tell them what we did. And that every day we woke up and we did everything humanly possible to fight for our democracy when it was under attack, when it was attacked in the Capitol on January 6th, when it was attacked by a president who spread the big lie, when it was attacked in courtroom after courtroom after courtroom. We did everything we could, and we may win every fight, we may lose some, we may win hopefully more than we lose. We'll win in the chambers of Congress, we'll lose in the chamber of Congress, but we fought. And that's really what keeps me going every day, is just knowing that I am doing everything I can so that decades from now, people will know that whether I succeeded or not, I tried with everything I had to fight for democracy.
Marc, Jose, Tamara, thank you for sharing a little bit of that inspiration with all of us on the other side of these screens this evening. And thank you also to each of you for the remarkably important, significant, massive work that you undertake on a daily basis on all of our behalf. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And for empowering us to be partners to you in this fight tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.